Good evening. My name is Dale Droz. I'm a United States District Judge for the Eastern District of California. Our Chief Judge, Kimberly Mueller, who joins us tonight, as well as myself and all of our colleagues, welcome you virtually to our court this evening for an excellent program, the San Joaquin River Litigation, Settlement, and Ongoing Restoration. This is one of a series of programs being presented by the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society and district courts across the Ninth Circuit, focusing on water-related issues. Tonight's program is also co-sponsored by the Sacramento chapter of the Federal Bar Association. What is the genesis of this presentation? Well, the San Joaquin River, California's second longest, has an obvious geographical connection to this district in that it runs through much of the land within our boundaries, but it also has a litigation history tied to this court. For many years, the late District Judge Lawrence K. Carlton presided over the litigation in the case of NRDC et al. Versus Patterson, which you'll hear about tonight. We have assembled an excellent panel of speakers to address the subject. Each of these eminent speakers deserves a much more full introduction than what I will be giving here, but in the interest of time, so you can hear what they have to say, I will give just a brief introduction, and Robin will post their full bios on the chat. We have with us Monty Schmidt. First, Monty is an elected director serving on the Marin Municipal Water District Board and a senior project director with the Nature Conservancy California Water Program. He has over 3 decades of experience in California, working collaboratively with water districts, farmers, state and federal agencies, and conservation groups on water resource management issues. Previously, Monty worked for the NRDC as a senior scientist and led the organization's efforts to restore flows and salmon to the San Joaquin River. Monty has a BS in biology from UC Santa Cruz and a master's degree in natural resource management from Cal Poly Humboldt. Next, we have Hamilton Hal Candy, a partner at Altshuler and Berzon LLP in San Francisco, where he represents environmental and fishing groups and local public agencies. For over 20 years, he was a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council and director of the NRDC's Western Water Project. He continues to represent NRDC and other non-governmental organizations in a range of matters involving protecting California's aquatic environment. He also previously was a legislative assistant in the United States Senate. He received a Clay Award as one of California's Lawyers of the Year in 1999 for his work pursuing restoration of the San Joaquin River below Friant Dam. Hal graduated from Princeton University and from NYU Law School, where he was a Root Tilden Scholar. And finally, Donald E. Ports, PhD. Dr. Ports has been the program manager for the San Joaquin River Restoration Program for nearly 6 years. He officially joined the office in 2015 as lead fish biologist, but had been working in the program since 2010. Dr. Ports has over 23 years of experience working with Bureau of Reclamation on fishery issues throughout the Western United States, with a particular focus on California's Central Valley. He received his doctorate degree in fish ecology from the University of California at Davis. And throughout his career, Dr. Ports has contributed greatly to fisheries research and survival of Chinook salmon and has been instrumental in the efforts to reintroduce spring run salmon to the San Joaquin River. Again, welcome. Please enjoy the program. And I'll now turn things over to Robin Lipsky, Executive Director of the Ninth Judicial Circuit Historical Society.
Thank you so much, Judge Droz. So happy to have all of you here. 2 quick housekeeping items before we get started. For those of you who are looking for CLE, your forms will go out in an email within about a week. And if we have time, at the end of the program, the panel has very graciously said that they would take questions. So you can put Q&A in the chat box and we will see if we can get to them. I just wanted to give you all this evening a broad overview of what the evening will look like. First, we'll hear from Monty, We're all focused here on the story of the San Joaquin River, which you heard from Judge Drozd is one of the longest rivers in California. But the story of the San Joaquin exemplifies challenges faced by so many rivers. I know that many of us need a bit of background about rivers and dams, and so Monty will talk to us about hydrology, dams, and flows and the impacts on salmon quantities and health. He will also share some details about history of the San Joaquin River with a focus on the impacts of the Friant Dam. Hal will tell us a little bit about the history of the San Joaquin River litigation, including introducing us to the parties, and we'll talk about the settlement, including what the elements of it are and the restoration and water management goals. Finally, Don will cover river restoration progress to date, including the successful elements that have already been implemented. He will update us on the fish, water flows, and how fish passages are progressing. And with that, I will turn it over to Monty.
All right, bear with me while I bring up presentation. All right, well, good evening, folks. And thank you, Judge Drozd and Robin, for the opening remarks and the introduction. And thank you to the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society for hosting this event and for everybody who's attending. Honestly, I think this is really a perfect time to talk about the San Joaquin River restoration effort because it's an exciting time, I think, in California's rivers, both in terms of opportunities and real challenges that we are facing with respect to the health of our rivers, to water supplies, and our fisheries. And as such, the San Joaquin really is a story about California's rivers and the challenges they face and how circumstances have changed over time, including laws that have brought about things that folks never thought. And early on in the restoration planning effort, there were, it would be dishonest not to say that there were lots of fears and concerns about what it would mean to restore the river. And I think that over time, those fears have given way to a fairly broad support by many who fought to prevent it because we were able to do something that showed that we could actually have a healthy living river while also sustaining an agricultural economy and provide a resource for communities along the river to enjoy a place to recreate. And I think probably one of the greatest examples of how attitudes and perceptions change is with Senator Feinstein, who said in the early 1980s that the San Joaquin River would never be restored on her watch. But in 2004, as Hal will talk about, I think she played a really pivotal role in helping to broker the settlement, and in 2009 was instrumental in securing the federal legislation that funded the program and a lot of the work that Don has done. So my job tonight is to provide some background, as Robin was mentioning, about the challenges facing California's rivers and our salmon, and then focus on the San Joaquin. And in doing so, I think hopefully tell a story about how the San Joaquin is really a story of hope for our rivers and our communities and the waters that we rely upon. So the challenges. Fundamentally, our rivers are really facing an issue driven by depletion of stream flows. Almost all the water that we use in our cities and for agriculture either comes from stream flow or it comes from groundwater, but a lot of it comes from our stream flow. And every amount of water that comes out of our streams in some small way degrades the health of our riverine ecosystems, which I'll talk about more in detail. But rivers they live on their water and they die without them. And without a doubt, the health of our aquatic ecosystems has also been driven by a decline in water quality. The lack of stream flow, plus we have a lot of runoff from urban streams and from other discharge and other pollutants that are getting into our rivers that are impacting our water quality. Our rivers also face a challenge with flood management. We're often focused on the lack of stream of flows in our river, but obviously in wet years, we have these extreme water events where we have flooding, and how we manage our floods impacts the health of our rivers in ways that are very challenging, and flood risk is a real issue in California. Our water rights system, this could be a whole series of panel discussions and presentations to talk about California's water rights systems and the challenges it presents. But I'll simply say that I think currently our water rights system is not flexible to help us deal with the challenges that we are facing, not only with our fisheries and the health of our rivers, but just water management in general. Groundwater management is another big challenge for our rivers. Oftentimes people think of groundwater as separate from our river flows, but really much of our groundwater is actually replenished from our rivers and streams. And when we deplete our groundwater, as we have done in many different places, depleted groundwater and dropping groundwater levels actually depletes our streams as well. So the connection there is very, very strong and very important. Aging infrastructure. A lot of our dams, canals, and other diversion structures are aging. Some of them are nearing 100 years or more old and are in need of repair or replacement or modification, if in the cases of adding, say, a fish passage ladder, because laws have come along that require fish passage. In the case of hydropower, hydropower is seeing in a number of cases where the cost benefit of hydropower is not as competitive as solar and wind and other sources. And so we have hydropower facilities that are aging out and are now obsolete and in need of maybe replacement or repair or removal. And then climate change is an issue that and a factor that is impacting all of these things that I have just mentioned, making the challenges that we are facing even more dire into the future. And to understand the impact that dams have on California is to recognize just how many there are. And as you can see from all these black dots, California has an incredible number of dams, 1,300 of which are over 35 feet. That's the larger dams. There are thousands more of smaller dams, which can have also significant impacts. But these dams created an incredible amount of storage. Almost the equivalent of half of our average annual runoff could be stored in our dams. And so that's an incredible amount of storage, which provides a lot of benefits. Chief among them, of course, is water supply. But our dams also provide flood control. In the San Joaquin Valley, where we're going to talk about, prior to there being any dams, the San Joaquin River would naturally, in an average year, would rise in its levels in the winter and spring and would flood miles from its primary channel, which was something it did naturally. And it created an incredible amount of habitat and groundwater recharge in the process. But now we have agriculture and cities very close to our river's edge, and that kind of flooding has an incredible impact on the economy and also on public safety. And hydropower. I mean, hydropower is an incredibly important element in our energy supply, and particularly in an era where we are addressing climate impacts and the carbon footprint of our energy production. But these dams come at a cost, and chief among them, with respect to the health of rivers and fisheries that we're talking about primarily today, is the alteration in the flow regimes. And I'll go into this in more detail in a second, but whenever our dams capture water and they store water, which means that they interrupt the natural flow of water moving downstream. So what comes into a dam is not what is released. And that change in the flow regime has significant impacts. But dams also trap sediment. So all the gravel, rock, and dirt that's moving downstream that flows into a dam is trapped there. Ultimately, this can end up filling up a dam and creating a hazard when you have dams that are basically filled in with sediment. But the impacts downstream are also significant. The lack of gravel and other sediment to replace what's being moved downstream means that the channel gets cut down and it gets deeper and deeper, and that impacts a lot of habitat for fish and wildlife. Dams are also a barrier to migration. And this is a real issue for salmonids, where over 50% of our high elevation habitat for fish is above our rim dams. And in a warming climate, that habitat is incredibly important, but the loss of it has been a major contributor to the decline of our fish populations over the last century. And dams also have temperature and water quality impacts. When you reduce stream flows downstream of a dam, they're more prone to warm up and make them less able to dilute water quality contaminants. So I know many of you who've joined tonight have come mostly from a legal background, but to understand the San Joaquin River, and any river really, especially one with a dam on it, it helps to understand the fundamental building block of a river, which of course is its water, and how plants and animals like salmon have evolved to depend on these flows in order to survive and thrive. So in its simplest form, a hydrograph, which is what you see in the upper left, depicts flow levels in a river throughout the course of a year. The one presented here is a generalized version that highlights specific components of a typical hydrograph of what you would see for stream flows in a Mediterranean climate. And to remind you, that means that almost all of our rainfall comes in a very short period between late fall, winter, and early spring, and then we have a very long dry season. And so the hydrograph depicted here is a generalized version, and hydrographs will change depending on whether it's a wet year or a dry year, but no two rivers share the same hydrograph, because differences in size of a watershed, or the geology of the watershed, or the climate of the watershed, whether it's in the Northern California or Southern California, changes the shape of the hydrograph. But each river shares this pattern, and the aquatic ecosystems that are supported by this river are intricately connected to the timing and the magnitude of stream flows. So I'll kind of explain that relationship now in the context of salmon. And I'll start by bringing up the fact that some people may not know that the water year has its own calendar, and it starts on October 1. And this marks the end of the long dry season that we often have. And so when we do water management, we often talk about October 1 as the beginning of the water year. With the first rains that we begin to get in October, our rivers experience some initial pulses. We call it a fall pulse. And what it looks like is we have a small rain event, and our stream flows go up a little bit, but not very significantly, but it's just enough. And it's enough that it's very important for some migratory salmonids, particularly fall run Chinook, that it's a cue for all the adults that are sitting waiting to move upstream. They feel that first pulse of water coming down, and it's a cue to begin migrating upstream, where they will ultimately migrate up, and they will spawn and lay their eggs, and they will die. With the continued rains we have in the wintertime, we see a higher elevated base flow of stream flow in our rivers and streams, which are then punctuated in these big storm events with higher peak flows. And these peak flows are extremely important from an ecological perspective for rivers, because during these high flows is when there's the most power in a river to do things like move the channel back and forth, or rip out old vegetation and reset habitat that's extremely important for a variety of fish and wildlife. And so those peak flows, while they can often result in flooding and other hazards, they are essential to the health of a river. As we move on into the later spring, as our rainfall, as our rainstorms begin to end, our climate begins to warm up, we have our snows begin to melt, we have what is called a spring recession. And this is basically that time of the year where we're past all the rains, and the flows in our rivers slowly recede down to what will become their summer dry season base flow. And the spring recession is also an incredible important time. It's when, for salmonids that are moving out to the ocean to migrate out, as fall run Chinook do, this is a time when the fish, that cue of the decreasing flow is a cue to get out and move downstream. It's also a time when those elevated flows are still inundating floodplain habitat and other areas where juveniles can feed. But also, really interestingly, and a great indicator of how connected stream flows are to our riparian ecosystems, is what happens with cottonwoods and willows. So when a cottonwood seed lands on a fresh piece of freshly laid sediment, as the flows are going down, that seed will germinate fairly quickly. And then the rate at which the flows are receding is almost, in a natural environment, equal to how fast the roots of a cottonwood or a willow tree can grow, which is about an inch a day. And so if there's a great example there in which how the health of a river and the nature of its flows is tied to the ecology of our riparian systems. Eventually, we get down into our dry season base flows, which are the time when our streams have the least amount of water in them. And they're the times also when, for certain species of salmonids, coho and steelhead, these fish, instead of their juveniles moving out to the stream, out to the sea in the end of the spring, they actually stay in their natal streams all year long. And so those dry season base flows, as small as they are essential to the life history, the success of these fish that then go out as yearlings. They go out as a bigger fish. And it's a different life history strategy than what fall run do by coming up earlier in the fall and the juveniles getting out by the spring, and the spring run Chinook come up as adults in the springtime. These different strategies that fish employ are all tied to this pattern of our rivers and flows. Well, given all the dams that we've built in California, and a lot of the other land use changes too, it's not just dams, we are clear that the health of our native fish is in very, very poor condition. And as you can see here from these statistics about the risk of extinction, the number of fish that are under management, the number that are candidates for listing, and the fact that 65% of our trout and salmon species are in danger of extinction by the end of the century tell us we're in dire circumstances. And if we don't do something broadly across the state, we are going to lose these fish, and along with it, many of the benefits that they provide us in terms of food and jobs and a healthy ecosystem. So what does it mean to have fish populations that are healthy? And I'm going to do a little foreshadowing here by also using the term good condition, because this is a term of art that was very important in the settlement agreement. And there are basically three tiers of fish health: an individual, a population, and a community level. At the individual level, we're talking about the basic needs of sufficient flow to complete the life history that I just ran through. Fish being able to make it upstream, to be able to spawn, for the juveniles to be able to emerge from the reds, and for those juveniles to make it back downstream, and all with suitable temperatures. But then we need a population level. How many is a safe and sustainable population? Is it 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000? To be self-sustaining and naturally reproducing, not propped up or aided by hatcheries, which have kept a lot of our runs from going extinct. You need a population level that can handle good years and bad years, because even prior to dams and humans coming to California, fish had good years and bad years. There were dry years and wet years. And so a population level needs to be large enough that it can handle those disturbances, good years and bad years, and persist. Next is this community level. And I think this really is talked about as a natural assemblage of other fish and insect species that go along with these fish populations. But I think it really speaks to the fact that, that a healthy fisheries is part of a healthy ecosystem, and that you can't have one without the other. So now I'm going to drill down into the San Joaquin River and provide some background information and start moving us toward the construction of Friant Dam. So San Joaquin River, it's 360 miles from headwaters to the delta. It historically supported runs of hundreds of thousands of salmon, and there were spring run, fall run, and steelhead, and there is an incredible abundance. And there are accounts of, historic, settlers in the area that talked about there were so many salmon that it kept them up late at night, or that they were so thick you could walk across their backs to cross the river. San Joaquin has three major tributaries: the Merced, the Tuolumne, and the Stanislaus, along with a number of other smaller streams that all contribute flow as you move downstream to the Bay Delta, which is obviously a very important part of California ecologically, as well as a source of water for 25 million Californians. And when we talk for the rest of the presentation, we're talking about, and when we talk about the restoration program reach, we're talking about a reach of the river from Friant Dam to the Merced. It's about 150 river miles, and Friant Dam is right near Fresno. So that's the reach of the river where a lot of the work we're going to talk about is focused. So the San Joaquin River. It begins in 10,000 Island Lake in the southern San Joaquin. It's some of the highest elevation peaks in the Sierras are in the southern San Joaquin, which is really important because it is one of the more climate resilient reaches of or stretches of the Sierras to maintain snowpack into the future. And along the San Joaquin, of course, there were Native Americans that lived along the river and flourished, taking advantage of the abundance of fish and wildlife and other resources. And in the 1700s is when the first Spanish explorers came to the region. And from there, things really began to change. And early agriculture began to flourish. There were again still huge salmon runs, which were part of the economy back then. And believe it or not, there were actually paddle boats that traveled all the way up the San Joaquin River from Sacramento to within 20 miles of Fresno. And so that tells you just how big the river was and how wide it was that it could actually handle a paddle boat. But things obviously began to change with the construction of dams, and 5 major dams were constructed, starting with Friant in 1942, all the way to 1979, when all the major tributaries to the San Joaquin had major dams built on them. And because of those dams and the water supply that was generated from it, more than 2 million acres of agriculture were added to the footprint. And the amount of incredible food and fiber production in the valley is outstanding at a world-class level. And 25% of our U.S. food production comes from the San Joaquin Valley. So this graphic kind of shows what I've been alluding to all along, which is the changes that occurred as we dammed our major rivers and agricultural production increased. And I just want to draw a little bit of attention to this 1850s graphic, which shows in light blue just how much of the valley floor was wetland and riparian. It was an incredible amount of area that was a vast wetland habitat that was fed by the rivers that now provide water supply. And then, as you can see, over the next 150 years, how much agricultural production came into play. Now, I can't possibly talk about the San Joaquin without also talking about groundwater, just for a minute. And to recognize that a lot of that agricultural production that I just pointed to came from not just our surface water supplies, but it also came from groundwater. And so much water came out of our groundwater that where the San Joaquin used to have places where there was artesian flow, water pushing up out of the ground, but thousands of wells have gone in and groundwater levels began to drop in the early 1920s. And over the next 50-year period, there was a recognition that we were taking so much water out of the ground that levels were dropping and the ground began to subside by almost 30 feet. And recognizing how that happens is when you take water out of the ground and it frees up all that space around the sediment, the ground ends up compacting. And what you end up losing is that space that can never be restored to store groundwater. So in many ways, it's an indication of how much groundwater storage we've actually lost. And that same rate of decline began to occur again in the recent drought starting in 2011. And it became so immediate apparent that it was going to become such a disaster that there was the political will and awareness among people in the valley that California needed to begin managing its groundwater resources. And that led to the passage of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, SGMA, which is driving groundwater management plans in critically overdrafted basins. And the intention is to is to create a sustainability so that groundwater levels don't drop below 2015 levels. And as a result of that, in terms of change on the landscape, there are estimations that as much as 500,000 acres of agriculture could come out of production in the San Joaquin Valley alone. That's a tremendous change. So Friant Dam. Friant Dam was constructed as part of the Central Valley Project. Construction began in 1939. It was built primarily for water supply, but also flood control was another purpose. And as dams go, Friant Dam has a storage of about 520,000 acre feet, which is actually not really particularly that large. It's a medium-sized dam in many respects. But now I'm going to talk about what happened from a fish perspective. So by 1941, the face of Friant Dam had been completed. And the impact of that initially was that became a barrier to fish being able to migrate upstream to spawning habitat. And it cut off about 2/3 of the spawning habitat. And then by 1942 and 47, we began to see there were still returning populations of salmon, some pretty large numbers, still oscillating as fish populations do, but they were still really significant numbers, those already in decline. But there was still water being released from Friant Dam because there wasn't a means by which to take that stored water and divert it elsewhere until the Friant, Kern, and the Madera canals were constructed. And once those canals came online, then the ability to actually divert that water away to the north and to the south enabled essentially capturing all the water, and virtually no water was released downstream. And we began to see fish populations declining. And the Department of Fish and Game at the time began a pretty heroic effort to try to save salmon while trying to work out some sort of means by which to keep the fish population alive. In the photo down below is a picture of a man named George Warner, who I was lucky to meet before he passed away, holding one of the very last spring run Chinook salmon that came upstream. But in 1950, it was recognized that the run was lost. And so a barrier was placed along the San Joaquin River. It's called the Hills Ferry Barrier. It's just upstream of the Merced River confluence, and it's there to block any fish from traveling upstream because there's no chance of success. So what did the river look like after Friant Dam was constructed? So here's that hydrograph again. And this is a hydrograph of the San Joaquin River, and it reflects an average year. And you can see in its undammed state, these are the orders of magnitude of flows that you could see in an average year: 14,000 CFS peak flows and base flows that are often over 1,000 cubic feet per second. The red line you see on the bottom is what the average flow in the San Joaquin River was after Friant Dam was constructed. Essentially, the water was all diverted, the life was taken out of the river, and the river dried up, and the salmon runs were lost. And so I'm going to stop there and hand over to Hal to talk about how the river was brought back to life.
Well, thank you very much, Monty, and thank you for that helpful background and overview. As you heard, even though the San Joaquin River is the second longest river in the state of California, it was essentially dewatered for 65 years by the United States government, which owned and operated Friant Dam, and it was to divert the water to the San Joaquin Valley and basically to benefit the farmers and irrigation districts on the east side of the valley, both through the Madera Canal and also the Friant Kern Canal. Monty's slides showed an example of some of the many miles of dry river that resulted from the diversions at Friant Dam, and those continued for most of the 70 years after the dam was built. As was evident from the map, the San Joaquin River flows west and then north to join the Sacramento River at Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, where they then flow into San Francisco Bay, forming the largest estuary on the west coast of North America. This amazing estuary is a hugely important environmental area for fish, for birds, and for other wildlife. Today, the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta is a source of water supply to approximately 25 million people, and that water is pumped south through massive federal and state pumps and other diversion structures. The litigation I am here to discuss focused on the major federal dam on the river, the Bryant Dam, and that's owned by the Bureau of Reclamation, part of the U.S. Department of the Interior. For decades, the dam had been diverting over 95% of the average natural flow of the river. And as I said before, it was delivered up and down the east side of the San Joaquin Valley. And only very small amounts of water were released from the dam, mostly for the benefit of the landowners living right below the dam. And none of that water was released for the river itself, including for fish and wildlife or for water quality. As Monty has referenced, these diversion operations had huge resulting impacts, including wiping out a major salmon run, devastating water quality, dewatering downstream wetlands, and impacting fish and wildlife habitat for many miles. So now to talk a little bit about the litigation, starting in the late 1980s and continuing for the next 3 decades, environmental and fishing groups tried to call attention to the plight of the San Joaquin River downstream of Bryant Dam. Indeed, the river was ultimately designated one of the most endangered rivers in the country. Our goal from the beginning was simply to change the operations of Bryant Dam, which were causing the river to be dried up and the fish to be killed. After all, since the time that the dam was built in the 1940s and permitted to begin full operations in the 1950s, so much had changed in terms of environmental laws and in terms of other state water needs and in terms of the potential for water conservation. So in 1988, a coalition of organizations led by the Natural Resources Defense Council filed litigation challenging the federal government's operation of the dam and the Bryant Division of the Central Valley Project. You can go to the slide there. There you go. At the time, I was a staff attorney at NRDC, and I filed the case. The case went on for many, many years and had many key rulings. As this slide indicates, there were rulings at the district court level, at the Court of Appeals level. It was a long period of litigation, and I can't summarize it all, but I will try to highlight some of the key points in the minutes that follow. But first of all, what were our objectives? We had 2 major objectives in filing this case. The first, when we had gone to the Bureau of Reclamation and asked them to just change their operation of Bryant Dam and start releasing some water into the river, we were told that was impossible because the diversions were memorialized in binding long-term federal water contracts, and that those contracts were supreme over environmental laws, both federal and state. So our first major policy objective was to do something about those long-term federal water contracts. And in challenging those contracts, we looked at procedural requirements like the Endangered Species Act and NEPA, and the very key fact that those long-term water contracts were about to start expiring. Even the US EPA and other federal agencies agreed with us that environmental laws like NEPA actually do apply to the renewal of federal water contracts, and that the initial water contract deals that were handed out in the 1950s and 60s were not necessarily locked in for all time. But our second major policy objective was to make sure, either indirectly through contract reforms or directly through other strategies, that water would be returned to the natural system, to the river below Bryant Dam, to help mitigate and undo some of the damage that had been done. In seeking legal handles to require water releases for the environment, we looked to the Mono Lake case for a model. Recall that in that case, the city of Los Angeles had been required to give up some of the water it had been extracting and diverting from streams on the east side of the Sierra in order to protect public trust values downstream at beautiful Mono Lake. The most powerful and direct weapon in the Mono Lake battle had been Section 5937 of the state's Fish and Game Code. I think the next slide has a quote from that statute. This 100-year-old statute applies to every dam owner in the state and requires every dam to release enough water to keep the fish below the dam in good condition. And over the years, this law has had a very interesting history. And the next slide kind of details some of the history of 5937. In particular, the state had specifically waived the application of that statute, Section 5937, to Bryant Dam because the dam was a federal dam. So the state's Department of Fish and Game had asked for water releases for salmon from Friant Dam based on Section 5937. And the state water board had refused and denied that request, saying that in their view, a federal dam was not subject to state laws protecting fish or fishing interests. That questionable ruling turned out to be a key element of our case in the years that followed. Clearly, a major focus of our case was salmon. As Monty has pointed out, there was such a huge amount of salmon in the San Joaquin River before Friant Dam was built and began operating. And salmon fishing groups were actually a big part of our coalition. Our coalition had 14 organizations. We had national environmental groups and local statewide environmental groups. We had fishing organizations, many of them, and they all worked together to help with our campaign. The salmon runs had fallen so dramatically as a result of the operation of Friant Dam. This was a cause that was very, very important to those fishing organizations. I know in a few minutes, Don Ports will be telling you about all the work that's going on now on the ground as a result of the settlement in our case to try to bring back the salmon and reintroduce the salmon to the San Joaquin. So I cannot detail all of the ensuing 12 to 14 years of legal battles that followed. But over the course of numerous years, as I think that original slide indicated, there were decisions at both the district court level and the Court of Appeals level. And frankly, our side won many of those decisions and many significant victories at multiple levels. And frankly, the case was both fought out in the federal district court in Sacramento, but also in the Ninth Circuit. However, this legal battle took enormous amounts of time and resources as the irrigation districts who had intervened in the case and the federal government, which was the defendant in the case, used their extensive resources to fight us on every procedural point imaginable. In our view, this was being done just to avoid simply looking for ways to conserve some water and share some with the downstream communities and release some for the natural environment. Oddly enough, even the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton and Al Gore actively opposed our lawsuit, and yet we kept winning in part because Justice Rehnquist of the U.S. Supreme Court had ruled that federal water projects, when they go into a Western state, are actually subject to state water laws unless there is a clear conflict with an express congressional directive. As our earlier slide indicated, there were several major rulings both on the federal water contracts part of our case and also on the application of the state Fish and Game Code to the federal government's operation of Friant Dam. For example, in the early 1990s, we won a key ruling that the state Fish and Game Code, Section 5937, is not preempted by federal law and therefore is applicable to Friant Dam. And in 1998, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled that our Section 5937 claim was not only not preempted, but it was fully ripe for adjudication. And they sent the case back to the district court and said it was time to issue a final ruling on the merits and determine whether a remedy was necessary. They also had a very important ruling about the water contracts and determined that the Endangered Species Act had been violated and that Judge Carlton, in issuing a remedy calling for the rescission of those contracts, was well within his judicial discretion. However, despite these favorable rulings by the Ninth Circuit, it wasn't until several years later that we received the clear ruling on actual liability for the government's violation of Section 5937, which was followed by a final ruling on the contract violations. These were then followed by a ruling by the court that it would hold a 2-month trial on the appropriate remedy for the violation of 5937, which would decide how much water must be released from the dam. And that trial was set to begin in 2006. It would take 2 months. While this court process may all seem very lengthy, and some of the core legal issues were relatively new, very complex, and there was an extraordinary amount of litigation at both the district court and the Ninth Circuit level. A key moment in the case was in 2004 when Judge Lawrence Carlton made the final ruling on the liability under Section 5937 of the Fish and Game Code and held that the Bureau of Reclamation was in violation of both federal reclamation law and the state Fish and Game Code by not releasing water from the dam to keep the fish in good condition. And later in 2005, we were told that the trial the remedy trial would start in 2006, and that's when things started to move forward towards settlement. It was during 2005, at the encouragement of Senator Dianne Feinstein, who you heard about earlier, who said, why don't the parties get together and see if they can work out a settlement that will call for the restoration of the river on terms that both the fry and irrigation districts and the federal defendants and also the plaintiff and environmental groups, environmental fishing groups can live with. Represented at the negotiating table were 14 plaintiff groups, 5 federal agencies, and over 18 irrigation districts. And after 1 full year of very intense talks, a sweeping settlement agreement was approved. It was actually ultimately approved by 55 different parties, and then by the federal court. And then after 3 years of work, in 2009, legislation authorizing the approval of the settlement and the implementation of the settlement was approved by Congress and signed into law by the president. Here's a slide showing that we have not only a settlement agreement, which is in the slide, but also there were accompanying agreements, including MOUs with the state of California and also with third parties. The settlement is lengthy and complex and includes environmental restoration measures as well as water supply measures for the fry and water users. Some of the key elements included making sure that the state of California, which was not a party to the case, although it filed numerous amicus briefs, would be supportive of the settlement and help fund it and help implement it. And that has been crucial ever since. There are also MOUs with how third parties who are not involved in the litigation at all would relate to the settlement effort. Today, 15 years later, the settling parties continue to implement the settlement, which provides benefits for all sides. In the next slide, we talk a little bit about the restoration goal. There are 2 primary goals in the settlement. One's called the restoration goal, the other's called the water management goal. On the restoration side, a key to the settlement was reintroducing and restoring salmon to the main stem of the San Joaquin River, which first required a restoration of flows into this dry river, and also key channel improvements to the degraded river to help with restoration, including structural measures to addressing fish passage and fish screens. As Don will explain, there have been important and ambitious efforts to bring back the iconic spring run salmon species to this long abused river. Of course, a crucial part of the restoration effort is the amount of flow that will be released below Fry Dam. And there were months and months of negotiations about what the flows should be. This slide shows you the hydrographs that the parties ultimately agreed to, which were addressed in very elaborate detail and had flexibility provisions in their buffer flows, the ability to manage those flows in different ways. And the flexibility provisions were essential to both sides. And that's part of where we got into using a technical advisory committee to help us, and which I'll talk about in a minute. Another part of this slide is the fact that the flow regimes were locked in place for quite a long time, but in 2026, the parties have the option of reopening that provision of how much flow is released in what they call the reopener provision. There are also an enormous number of provisions required for actual structural changes in the river, for fish passage, for helping with the channel maintenance, et cetera. I think the hydrographs at the very bottom mentions the reopener provision. Completion of the various ongoing restoration projects, which Don will be describing to you, and the establishment of fully adequate in-stream flows, which you still do not yet have, are still going to be crucial for a successful salmon restoration. But the program's initial early salmon reintroduction efforts have been very encouraging. One important footnote is that the reopener clause is coming up in 2 years, and the plaintiff coalition has the option to go back to court. And if it does that, the matter would be sent to the State Water Resources Control Board, which would then make findings and recommendations. The other major goal of the settlement was what we called the water management goal. I think this goes to our next slide. And oops, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, the most altered river in California. This slide is just an indication of some of the challenges that Don's team is facing. We have multiple dams. We have enormous and elaborate flood control structures, and all of these create fish passage issues. So you'll be hearing more about those as well. The next slide is about the water management goal. And this was a very important parallel goal in the settlement. And the goal there was to reduce or avoid water supply impacts to the water users in the Friant irrigation districts. This included something called a recovered water account to make more wet year water available to Friant irrigation districts at reduced prices. And the theory there was that when there are those years where you have a lot of water available, a lot of these districts do conjunctive use, where they sink the extra water into the ground and keep it stored in the ground, and then reuse, take the water back out of the ground in the drier years. And so this was to encourage more of that conjunctive use. There was also a program for recirculation of restoration flows once they had gone downstream, provided that recirculating the flows back to the irrigators would have no adverse impact on downstream water quality or on the restoration of flows for fisheries. Interestingly, this water management goal actually achieved greater success in the initial years after the settlement was signed, with greatly reduced water supply impacts to the numerous Friant irrigation districts. There are other provisions that help with the meeting the water management goal, and even the federal settlement legislation that was passed in 2009 added some more provisions, such as increased federal support for more groundwater wells and more measures to help the Friant irrigators. One element of the settlement that both the environmental plaintiffs and the Friant water districts felt very strongly was essential was an independent restoration administrator and an independent technical advisory committee. And on the technical advisory committee, which is convened by the restoration administrator, there are representatives of the Friant irrigation districts, representatives of the plaintiffs, and also some independent scientists who are jointly selected by both sides. Although we have had important successes in implementing the settlement, we have also had to fight off opposition and resistance in both California and in Washington, D.C. And we've also had to contend with things like budget shortfalls, both federal budget shortfalls and state budget shortfalls, and of course, unprecedented droughts. But we continue to make progress, although far more slowly than our plaintiff groups had hoped. One quick note about the dynamics among these numerous parties that are involved in this case. Throughout the litigation, the environmental and fishing plaintiffs and the numerous irrigation districts who had intervened on the side of the government as defendants in the case were sharp adversaries. And even during the prolonged settlement negotiations, the two sides maintained very different goals and beliefs. But once a settlement was reached, the two sides became allies in a sense through their shared goal of getting the settlement approved, first by the court and then by the Congress. Further, after that, they became allies in seeking to secure federal and state funding and the necessary permits to carry out the restoration program. There have, of course, been times when that alliance was strained over the years, but even to this day, the two sides have remained aligned in seeking protection of the settlement, full funding, and more vigorous implementation of the settlement. Finally, there remained some individual landowners downstream along the river who were not parties to the settlement and had not been, because they had chosen not to intervene in the case, they were not parties, but who had benefited economically from the prior status quo of a dry river. These individuals were sometimes critical of the ambitious plans embodied in the text of the settlement and its day-to-day implementation. In some cases, they felt that the project was too ambitious or too expensive or would cause too much change. While these factors are not surprising in the complex dynamic of a huge river like this and a 70-year-old water project, the result of this was slower progress on river restoration, increased costs to the program, and some additional legal and political challenges. Nevertheless, the message today is that the plaintiffs and the settling parties, the federal government and the Friant irrigation districts continue to believe that this restoration settlement makes a lot of sense. And I think the next slide is has a little bit about the views of the plaintiffs, is that the restoration of a major river like this has enormous benefits, and the benefits are widespread and they are long-term. And they range from recovery of an iconic salmon species to improve recreation opportunities for downstream communities, et cetera. I know that in a minute or two, Don will be discussing some of the progress and challenges experienced by this landmark settlement effort. I just want to say that the long history of our legal battle and complex settlement process has included an amazing array of federal and state challenges, both political and legal. And just to cite one example, some of you may have heard of a congressman from the area, our former congressman named Devin Nunes. He actually represented a lot of the Friant districts, even when every single Friant district in his congressional district came to him and asked him to support the settlement. He disagreed. He said he didn't support the settlement. And on several occasions, he tried to introduce legislation to repeal it. And in fact, he never fully succeeded, but he did get his repeal proposal initially passed by the House of Representatives on 2 different occasions. But as I mentioned, he is no longer a member of Congress. And in fact, Congress has continued to fund the settlement every single year since the settlement was passed. I will now turn things over to Don Quartz, who leads the interagency team of the restoration program based at the Bureau of Reclamation, and he can bring us up to speed on the current implementation of the settlement. That concludes my overview, and thank you all very much for listening.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. Hopefully that our screen swap there was successful. I will apologize, as I am not quite as gentlemanly as my esteemed colleague, Mr. Candy. And throughout my presentation, I might drop a few F words, such as fish, flows, flood, farmers, funding, all the good stuff, right? No. In all seriousness, I think the passion and dedication of the 3 speakers that you're going to hear from tonight is clearly visible. We've seen significant, slow but significant progress on the restoration program, and the benefits of the restoration and implementation of the settlement for the San Joaquin River is on Hal's last slide is quite evident in the San Joaquin and Valley. I think not merely the benefits of having a connected river from the headwaters down now to the delta, including the whole 152 miles of the restoration area that Monty discussed. It's not only about that we have Chinook salmon returning to the river, as Hal indicated. We have other fish coming back. We have now lamprey and sturgeon and other anadromous fishes now that are coming back to the river system, and other native fishes as well. We have, soon to be benefits of new water infrastructure projects that are going to protect fish and more effectively deliver water for irrigation. We have huge benefits to disadvantaged communities. We built a bridge a few years ago that will access a future construction site. And this was a huge benefit to the city of Mendota, as this bridge carried over its water infrastructure, its water supply lines across the Fresno Slough, and made reliable water for the community. Brings also benefits for disadvantaged communities, include all the construction money, all the future long-term growth of having an active river. But most of all, it's the changes in the mindset of people, that the river becomes part of a culture and a value system when it's returned. The most ambitious river restoration project of its time has not come without its challenges. Based on what you've seen in the preceding slides, you saw a most altered river in California. You saw a dry riverbed that was dry for over 65 years, except when in instances of flood. You saw the extirpation of salmon since around 1950 and the decline of native fishes. You saw flow routing that augmented a historic river channel, and decades of water operations unique to the San Joaquin that have not supported fish. But before I go into the successes of the restoration goal, I did want to spend a little bit of time before we do that focusing about the exciting work to bring back flows and fish, but I think it would be really unfair to talk about that without mentioning some of the great work from the water management goal successes. Well, sorry. As indicated from Hal, the water management goal, and I'll read it to you since we didn't do that before, but the water management goal is specifically to reduce or avoid adverse water supply impacts to all the Friant Division long-term contractors that may result from the interim flows and restoration flows provided for in the settlement. Hal mentioned a bunch of different water management goal activities, projects. I'll highlight a few of them. Sorry. One of the things that's really most important is the restoration flow guidelines. In the settlement, it describes procedure. This was procedures and guidelines developed to comply with paragraph 13J of the settlement, determining water year types, timing of flows, measuring and monitoring all flows, accounting, seepage losses. Really, really important aspect of the program. This is done with all the settling parties, the implementing agencies, the RA, and the TAC. We also have a recovered water account, which was covered a little bit earlier. This is to replace or offset the impacts of restoration flows on Friant. We also have been working on recapture that Hal also alluded to, of recapture of flows after they leave the restoration area by Friant, and then to be able to recirculate those restoration flows back to Friant, potentially something that we've been working on for decades, but the settlement says that you develop a plan. Still in progress there. Another one of the, and probably one of the most important factors of the water management goal current group that we have is improved forecasting. Working with DWR, our area office, our Airborne Snow Observatory, the RA, and many others. We use flights, basically LiDAR flights that basically take images of the snow pillows and the snow precipitation that's up in the mountains to better, more accurately forecast and determine how much water is available. Some of the more seen projects are physical projects. Friant Current Canal capacity, I think most of you probably heard of that if you're familiar with this lower San Joaquin Valley. And many miles of the Friant Current Canal were subsiding. And through the Restoration Act, and that we were able to rebuild some of these sections of canal. Another physical project was the Madera Canal Capacity Correction Project, and it hasn't happened yet, but is planning to happen, where again some of the sections of the Madera Canal will be replaced. And then I think something that was mentioned earlier is Part 3 groundwater projects. These are like Kimberlina Basin projects off of the Friant Current Canal, which are recharging groundwater in areas, and these are all authorized and somewhat funded from the Restoration Act. So, how do the restoration goal and the settlement and the water management goal interact? And they're two different spheres in this Venn diagram, but what overlaps them is flows in the river. I think without the water management goal, you couldn't have the restoration goal. So it's really important. But today's focus, I'm going to focus on fish, flows, and then the facilities that will protect those fish as they move upstream and allow them to move stream over the dam. So again, dropping some of those F words here to you all. So what do we need for successful fish on the river? And I think, you heard really best from Monty and Hal that we need to improve the channel capacity and improve the water flowing down to the delta. We have to bring back fish. There were no fish in the river, and build some of that habitat back in. And so these are important components in the settlement, specifically paragraph 14 of the settlement and paragraph 13 for flows. I know a lot of you probably have not visited Bryant Dam or the river. So let me just show you a short video of some fish actually swimming up near the dam below Bryant Dam. This is a section of the river called Reach 1. This area has always been wetted. This area, even after the Bryant Dam was constructed, was delivering flows to some holding contractors below. So there was minimal flows in the river, but not enough flows to connect the lower river, connect this portion of the river with the lower river. These are some fish that made it up in a flood year, or potentially were ones that we released from a hatchery, and I'll be discussing that in a moment. These fish would hang out all summer in holding habitat below the dam, and then, as Monty said earlier, they would spawn in September or October. As you see these fish congregating here, getting ready to spawn, with a ripe female there that's in the center of the screen. This is a section of the river that is fairly rocky. So this is Reach 1 right here, 1A, 1B. This is the spawning and holding habitats. As we go downstream for the last 65 years, it became dry here at Gravelly Ford. And then it was dry in this Reach 2A structure. And then only when you got below Mendota Pool and deliveries were being made from San Luis Reservoir for the exchange contractors, would the section between Mendota and Sac Dam be wet, because there was deliveries being made, contractual deliveries. And then the river would go dry again until refuge flows back to the river channel or backwater from the Merced would wet these sections. So you'd be wet, dry, wet. And obviously, this is not something that's conducive for fish migration, whether they're moving downstream as juveniles or upstream adults to hold and to spawn. This map shows some of the major infrastructure projects that we are currently doing, that I'll be discussing over the next few minutes. So I mentioned the groundwater projects down here that are complete. The Scarf is the hatchery here below Millerton. And then the Mendota Pool, Arroyo Canal projects. And then I'm going to talk a little about East Side Bypass Fish Passage. These are the three major fish passage projects. So the first recipe, the first thing we need is fish. We got to bring fish back. There's the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has built and ready to open this year a conservation facility. The settlement does not call out a conservation facility or hatchery, as the restoration goal was intended to have natural reproducing self-sustaining population of fish, but you got to start somewhere. This facility, the future facility, will rear over 1 million juveniles that we will release to the river annually. Currently, we're using an interim facility and only produce about a quarter of that to the river. So this slide here is showing you that in 2012 we started our efforts to come up with a brood stock, mommies and daddies to raise babies, basically, and we started releasing fish. At first spring run to be released in 2014. These came from the Feather River, and we continued with releasing fish from the Feather River for the first few years. And then we started taking over, releasing our own fish that were produced at the Scarf, as it's called, the hatchery, for up until now at the interim facility at about the rate of 200,000 fish a year. Well, we had great spawning success. 2017 was a really good year for the restoration program. We had our first confirmed spring run Chinook salmon spawning on the San Joaquin in over 60 years. So huge successes. This was a really triumphant moment, because a lot of folks said, because of global warming, because of river changes, because of non-native predators, all these things, that this just was not going to occur. So this was a first great check on our ability to to say, yes, this program can work. We can do this. Also, 2 years later, in 2019, we had our first documented adult spring run salmon return from the ocean. So generally, these fish take about 2, 3, 4 years to return the ocean, go out as juveniles, as Monty said, and then return a few years later as adults. This is the actual first spring run here. Funny thing is that through genetic analysis, and we take tissue samples of every fish, and we look at their genes. We look at what who the parentage was, and all that sort of thing. And we found out from juveniles that this was actually not the first fish that returned. This is the first fish we actually caught. But in 2017, during a high water event, fish actually made it on their own from the ocean. Some of the dams have stop logs. They pull all the stop logs. So these fish moved up through or went through the flood. There's a parallel flood way. They went up through there. But regardless, they made it to the base of Friant Dam and they spawned. And we learned from their offspring that fish actually started coming back in 2017. Really exciting. This was the moment that we knew, yes, you build it, they will come. So let's continue to put flows in the river. Let's get to work on the major infrastructure. So 2024 spring run adults generally come in April, May, June from the data that we've collected. And we're looking forward for our 7th year of adult spring returns. We did not get any fish in 2018 that we're aware of. But this is a huge milestone for the restoration program. So the second item that you need, we got our fish. We were doing really well on the fish. The state is rocking it there, and they are producing fish, and we're going to have that hatchery open this summer, being able to produce 1 million fish and release. Well, we need to increase our flows, or the ability at least to increase our flows here in the coming years. I'm not going to go over the hydrograph. I think everyone did a great job before me. There are 6 water year types, and different water year types that provide different amounts of water. That's in Exhibit B of the settlement. The hydrographs are based mainly on the migration and life cycle of Chinook salmon that Monty talked about earlier. But I think the main things to point out here is that we've had interim flows in the river since 2009, shortly after the signing of the Settlement Act. We've had restoration flows that began in 2014. And then the restoration administrator was able to connect that river in October of 2016. Again, major advances to a river that was dry for 65 years. Our colleagues, another implementing agency is California Department of Water Resources. They and Reclamation have been working on improving channel capacity. This is one slide that just shows a levee project that they did, and it's called Reach-O. And this was, significantly increased the amount of capacity in that reach. We have numerous levees to build within the restoration area to reach our goal of 4,500 CFS. Some of the other items, so you improve capacity by building this infrastructure, but you also have to remove some of the old infrastructure that might be fish passage impediments or potentially a flow constraint. And so in 2019, we removed 2 weirs on the Merced National Wildlife Refuge that we felt as fish biologists was either a predator hotspot or, like I said, would block debris and would be blocked by debris, and flows wouldn't be able to be increased to 4,500 CFS. So we removed that and working on removing other impediments. But we're looking, it's looking really promising. Another factor that is currently a constraint for increasing flows is seepage is seepage. Seepage is where the water in the river is higher than the land on either side, and this water leaves the river and moves out into the land beside it. And what you see here is you can get this water moving laterally in the landscape, can get out into the farmers' fields and affect the root zone. Our current mechanism for this, we looked at many different projects to stop this water from moving. Current mechanism is to work on easements to allow for this water to leave the system. But in some areas, we might develop a physical project to keep the water in the river so we can maintain that connectivity and not have additional losses. The final thing is the final item to be able to bring fish back to the river, and this is something, this is the main focus of the restoration program currently, is fish passage. There are numerous dams on the river or fish impediments, and these fish cannot get either downstream as juveniles or upstream as adults. The first one is kind of the crown jewel of the restoration program is the Mendota Pool project, the Reach 2B Improvements Project. This is a really large project that includes a 3/4 mile bypass around Mendota Pool and then a fish screen to keep those fish out of Mendota Pool. It includes miles of levee from Mendota Dam, pretty much all the way to the Chowchilla bifurcation structure, which is, and I'll show you on the next slide, the focus of that. This area only can support, well, currently it's at capacity is 1,210 CFS. So not able to move as much water as we should be able to through this section because of some of the whether they're seepage constraints, but in this case, a levee constraint. So many of these levees are not built to withstand flood or higher flows, such as 4,500 CFS. So this is the project overall. And the intent is to build levees. This is Mendota Pool down here. I know it looks like a piece of a field, but this is all the water hyacinth growing over this small hub, distribution hub for the exchange contractors. But we're looking here, and the dam is here. What we're intending to do, this is the river. This is the Chowchilla bifurcation structure. The river meanders through this section. And our intent is to build a 3/4 mile bypass to circumvent this whole distribution hub of the Mendota Pool. With that are the setback levees and then the floodplain in between that will create fish habitat, floodplain rearing habitat, and provide protections for neighboring landowners and maintain 4,500 CFS of flows throughout this section of the river. As I said before, there will be a fish screen that in a sense, when there's flood flows, some water goes into the pool, and there's this thing called a call on friant where they can call on their senior water rights, and the exchangers can, and we would screen those fish so they're not lost in the pool and put them back into the bypass, any fish. So this is basically an aerial view of here's the Mendota Pool and the river coming down, and our new bypass will go through this green section of land and back to the river. And that's, for the sake of time, I'm going to move forward. All right, the second project is the Arroyo Canal Fish Screen and Sac Dam Fish Passage. This was the first project that we intend to build back in 2011. And I think Monty did a good job of talking about subsidence earlier, and we had a 90% design. We were getting ready to go and to build the design back in 2011. And then we found out that the ground was sinking, and that made the current design at the time unusable. We wouldn't have been able to. Fish wouldn't have been able to pass it. It would have been velocities too high through the structure, and it wouldn't have functioned well to support the Arroyo Canal here to support the Henry Miller Reclamation District, who takes their exchange contractor water off the river at this location. This is the river here. This is downstream towards you, upstream away from you, and so water moves down. This is during a flood, and dam is pretty much underwater. But what I wanted to show you here is the Arroyo Canal just comes off the river unscreened. Paragraph 11A6 and 7 of the settlement call for fish passage at Sac Dam and to screen anadromous fish at the Arroyo Canal. Oh, there's my subsidence slide, sorry. This is our one of our current alternatives. That is this design is the 2024 design that is currently at a 90% design, this has a lot of the similar design. We've looked at over 11 iterations of different designs for this project now. This is the leading design, and it consists of a screen that goes the river now, similar to the Reach 2B project, is going to go around the current structure. So Sac Dam is going to stay here in the river, and a screen is going to be placed across the current river, and we're going to move the river out along the right bank and around the structure, and then have a berm here that cuts fish off from swimming upstream over the structure in the canal. So essentially cutting off the Arroyo Canal and providing a fish screen here where deliveries can be made to them. It consists of two different fish paths. So there's a fish ladder on the left bank, and then a ramp, fish ramp on the right bank to accommodate other species other than salmon, such as sturgeon. And then to pass 4,500 CFS at this structure, we have a river bypass through the center of the project. The last project is the Eastside Bypass Control Structure. This is the most downstream structure that's needed to have adult fish be able to pass through the river. And this project is led by California Department of Water Resources, as this structure belongs to the state of California. Similar to or a little bit different than the other designs that we saw for the Mendota Dam and Sac Dam, is that this is going to be a swim-through design. And so they are going to put a rock ramp basically down below this structure, which will allow fish to swim up and through the structure, and then go up to Sac Dam, Mendota Dam, and to the base of Friant, where they'll spawn in Reach 1. One last slide. This is the last. This is one of the wild returning fish that came back, and she's starting to form a red so that she can spawn. But this is one of the greatest milestones in my career, certainly, to see this, for the first time on the San Joaquin. And I think we're all really excited about this. So I'm going to hand this back. I'm going to stop my presentation, hand this back over to Robin, and I did intentionally move quickly so we can take on some questions.
Thanks so much. And to all of you, hopefully we can get all of our panelists back on. There we are. We do have just time for one or two questions. Thank you so much to give you time to answer the questions. We have a question. Implementation of the settlement has included petitioning for and obtaining approval of several temporary water rate changes under Water Code Section 1707 to protect the in-stream flows provided by releases from Friant Dam. What is the status of preparing a request for a long-term or permanent change under Section 1707?
I'll take a stab at the first answer. First of all, it's always great to have a staff attorney from the State Water Board inviting further petitions to the State Water Board through that question, and thank you. The way this works is that the settling parties work together on anything like that, and I know there's some federal attorneys listening in today, and there's some Friant attorneys listening in, and any further step like that would be discussed by all of the different attorneys for the different settling parties. I don't think we have any immediate plan to roll out and put out there at the moment, but I would say that's certainly part of the larger long-term discussion that's going on. And if it would be helpful to the questioner, I would be happy to set up a conference call with the attorneys for the federal agencies, the attorneys for the Bryant districts, and our own attorneys, because we'd love to have that discussion.
Great. Thanks. One final question before we let everyone go. Can any of you talk about climate change and if it will have any effect on the settlement?
Well, probably the other two are better equipped, but let me just start by saying, obviously, climate change impacts everything in the world of water in California and in terms of the fish. And it's, from the earliest times of this case, the fishery experts we were talking to felt that the San Joaquin River, because it starts so high up in the Sierra and has such cold water, is actually a very important river to be restoring, and that there may be some real advantages to trying to bring back the salmon on the San Joaquin. So I don't know if Monty or Don has any thoughts about that, but that is certainly one of the things that people have been considering in the last several years.
Yeah, I'll start off, and then maybe Monty can add some things to that. As a non-biologist, Hal, you did a wonderful job with that. I think, and Monty talked about this in his part of the presentation. And like you just said, part of the the watershed is so high in elevation, and in most years we get pretty good precipitation up there, and the snow melt because it's so high in elevation is later in the season. It is being looked at as, this river system might be one of the areas that holds the spring run into the future as populations in the north in Butte Creek and start to dwindle, and we bring back spring run here. This might be the river in California in years to come that then seeds fish back to these other rivers because of its unique position. I think that we need to have better, reservoir management and release management. And of course, I talked a little bit about forecasting. We're going to have to do a better job with all that to maintain temperatures below Bryant Dam. But I think when I speak to my colleagues at fisheries agencies, this is something that we're all kind of looking at right now as to keep the run alive in California, not only on the San Joaquin, but throughout the state.
I won't add anything if we can get one more question.
I actually think we're really out of time, but I wanted to take time to thank all of you. What an incredible amount of work you put into this presentation, and it was so informative and interesting. I've learned a ton. I know everyone who joined us learned a lot this evening. I also wanted to thank the Federal Bar Association for being our partner, and most of all for the Eastern District of California Court for their support of this incredible program. And we're so excited to have had you all here this evening. For those of you, just a reminder that if you joined us by phone for any reason, please just send us an email so we know that you were here if you needed CLE credit. And otherwise, I'm going to wish you all a good evening, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks.